Hello, Hub City kids. How are you doing today? Did you have a good week? You can take some time to think about all of the good things that happened to you this week, and you can talk about them as a family. And do you remember why we do that? Because every good and perfect thing comes from above. So all of the good things that we take time to appreciate and show gratitude for, that is a way of us worshiping God and thanking Him for the gifts that He gives us all of the time and for remembering Him. Because when we think about this story of Exodus, we see how often the Israelites forget who the hero of their story was. And it's hard to judge them when we know that we're doing the same thing all of the time. So just taking a couple of minutes to remember all of the good and beautiful and precious and wonderful gifts that God gives us on a daily basis is a good way of remembering who He is and keeping Him close to our hearts and in our minds. So you can take some time to remember that. So what happened last week? Do you remember? God was on a mountain and He had His people at the foot of the mountain, and there was thunder and lightning and the whole mountain was trembling. And remember, 3 days before that, His people had to spend some time preparing their hearts and their bodies and their minds and being clean so that when they came in the presence of God, they were as clean as they could possibly be. And God said, I'm going to make a covenant with you, which, remember, a promise. I'm going to make a covenant with you, and I'm going to give you this set of expectations, and do you promise that you'll follow them? And what did the people say? Yes, we do, we will. We'll follow you. We'll do whatever you say. And then Moses went up the mountain and spent time in God's presence, and God gave him 10 commandments, 10 rules. And do you remember what the point of those rules were? Were they expectations that those people were going to follow all of those rules all of the time? No, because God knew that they would fail, that we would all fail all of the time at keeping those rules. But He does want us to work to make those rules, to keep those rules, partially because those are God's way of setting His people aside. He wants us, in an act of worship and remembering who He is, He wants us to love Him. He wants us to love each other. And He wants us to look different because we love Him than the other people around us. Remember, we talked about like an OSU sports jersey, when you look different than the people around you because you love the Beavers. And then anywhere you go, if you see somebody else wearing a Beaver jersey, you know, hey, you're Beaver fans too. And you look separate and you're different than the people around you. That's what the 10 Commandments are for. He wants us to look different than the people who don't love Him. So that was last week. This week, I have some bad news. Those Israelites forgot God again. Really, really quickly. So that last week we read in Exodus chapter 20. And today we're going to read out of Exodus 32. So those other 12 chapters are more rules that God set for His people. Remember, we said that there were 600 different rules that He made. And the 10 Commandments are kind of a huge overview, but then He gets really, really specific. And some of them are, now when we read them, we see that it's really important because in the olden days, they didn't know about germs. And God has a lot of rules about washing your hands, which especially now we know with coronavirus, washing your hands is really, really important. So they might have seemed like silly rules, but a lot of them were for His people's own good, things like that. Some of them we just don't fully understand, except they're just ways to set His people apart. So it took a really long time for God to give Moses all of those rules. The 10 Commandments He wrote in stone on those like tablets things that you're probably familiar with. But so those 12 verses or chapters between 20 and 32 are just more rules. And then in those 40 days that Moses was with God, what do you think his people did? We're going to read about that. So we're going to read 32, 1 through 8, and you can read the whole thing. The whole thing's a pretty good story. About 1 through 8 is the most important part for what we're going to talk about today. And after you read those 8 verses, I want you to talk through as a family through the things that you remember, and you can even talk about things that you learned about yourself, about God's people, and about God himself in that chapter if you want. Ready? Pause. So what did you learn? What happened? It's crazy, right? 40 days before, God's people were standing at the foot of the mountain, terrified because God was so amazing and so powerful, they didn't even want to go up the mountain. They said, please, we can't handle seeing your face. Send Moses because you are too amazing and too powerful and too great for all of us to handle. And now, what happened? Now, they are saying, it's taking too long. We want something we can see and worship. So what do, Aaron? Remember, Aaron is Moses' older brother. And Aaron is a priest that God made to lead his people. So what does Aaron do? He tells all of God's people to take their earrings off, to take their rings off, to take their necklaces off, and to burn them in a big pot and make that huge gold into a huge statue of a calf. What do you think about this? It's kind of weird, huh? One, where did they get all of that gold? Do you think that slaves probably had lots of gold earrings and gold necklaces and gold bracelets? Do you remember back all the way from the Passover? God promised, even before that, God promised his people before the plagues that when he brought them out of Egypt, he would take care of them. Not just with food and water, but with money too. That he would take care of all of their financial needs. And so after the Passover, do you remember what the Egyptians did? They gave the Israelites all of their gold and silver and jewels. And so the Israelites are leaving slavery with all kinds of valuable possessions that the Egyptians just gave to them because that's what God told them to do. And now, after all that God has done for them, what are they doing? They are melting that gift from God down and making their own little g God out of it. And what do they make? A cow. Of all of the things that I think I would want to worship, a cow would not be one of them, especially after I had just seen a mountain trembling and speaking words through thunder. I would not want to worship a cow, but that is what the Israelites did. They made their own God, and they made a cow, and they made it with the materials that God had gifted to them. This makes my heart kind of sad. Have you ever heard the word idol? We talked about it in the 10 Commandments yesterday. Idol. An idol is anything that we make to stand in the place or as a substitute for what God should be and is. So in this case, they made an idol out of a calf, out of gold, and they made it. So that's a pretty big clue that it's not really God. If we can make it ourselves, then it's not really God. And do you remember the first 2 commandments? You shall have no other God before me. and you shall not make any graven image. That's kind of old language, but it means you should not make anything that represents who I am like that. This is not God. This is a cow. So it's not God for sure. God's people are not letting God be the hero of the story. They are trying to become the heroes of their own story. And it's pretty easy to look at them and say, I would never do that. I think worshiping a cow is stupid and silly, and I would never ever do that. But like most of the Exodus story, it's pretty convicting because we do that all of the time. It might not be a cow, but we make other idols. We make other things take the place of God, and we try and make idols and make gods ourselves. We try and become the heroes of our own story. So think about that a little bit this week. What are the things that you hold on to so closely that you rely on them to be the heroes of your story? We all have something. How does God feel about this situation? He is angry. He is very, very angry. He sends Moses back down the mountain. And later on in the chapter, you see that Moses is so angry with his people that he takes the calf and he melts it down, and then he puts it in the water and makes his people drink it. He makes them drink all of this gold statue. And that's pretty gross. So God is angry. Does that change his rescue plan at all? It doesn't. God still has his plan in place to be the hero of his people's story, to be the hero of this story. What you didn't read in those 8 verses is that the people still have consequences. He told them at the beginning that if you don't listen to my words, then I will bring a plague on you. And he did. But he still had mercy on them. And it wasn't the worst plague in the world. And his rescue plan is never taken away. But there are consequences for their actions. So the people wanted something to worship that they could feel and see and who was with them all of the time. Since clearly the whole mountain thunder thing wasn't enough for them. So what did God do? What is his rescue plan? He sent them Jesus. He sent them something that they could see and feel and touch. And we can't see and feel and touch Jesus right now. But God's plan was even bigger than that, because when Jesus died, the Holy Spirit came and was with us all of the time. We don't talk about the Holy Spirit nearly as much as Jesus, but we should, because the Holy Spirit is a very important part of God's rescue plan. The Holy Spirit stayed here on earth with us when Jesus went back up to heaven. And we often can't touch the Holy Spirit, but we see all of the good things that God did for us. And we can hear the Holy Spirit. Sometimes it's a little whispering in your heart or in your head that is God's words to us. Sometimes we can actually hear God speaking to us. And the Holy Spirit is God's way of being with us now. And that's very, very important. So what does this teach us about us? We are always forgetting. Always, always, always. But what does this teach us about God? That even when we forget, he is always saving us. He is always with us. And he is always the hero of our story. And that doesn't change. So for our coloring page today, I have this picture of the golden calf. And this is a reminder to us to think of what our idols are. What are those things that you are putting in place of God, that you are relying on or counting on or making your little g God because you want something to provide for you that isn't going to provide for you, because that calf is not even close to being as amazing as God is. And that calf isn't ever going to provide for you either. So have a good week, Hub City, and I hope I will see you all very, very soon.